It was a quiet evening when Jane sat in her living room, flipping through a magazine. The day had been unremarkable, yet an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the gray clouds that hung low in the sky. But her unease only deepened when her husband, Daniel, walked in with an unreadable expression on his face. "Did you hear about the old house on Baker Street?" he asked, breaking the silence. Jane looked up, confused. "No, what about it?" "It's being demolished," Daniel said, sitting down heavily on the couch. "The Petersons have to move out." Jane's heart sank. The Petersons were an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She couldn't imagine them leaving their home. "Where will they go?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "That's the thing. They're staying with us for a while." Her stomach twisted. "What? Here? When did you decide that?" "Today," Daniel said nonchalantly. "They need a place, and we have room." Jane felt the weight of the situation settle over her. Their house wasn't small, but it wasn't large enough to comfortably accommodate 2 more people, let alone an elderly couple with specific needs. The thought of their daily routines being upended filled her with dread. "You could have asked me first," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Daniel waved her off. "It's only temporary. Don't overthink it." That night, Jane lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with questions. Why had Daniel agreed to this without consulting her? And why did she feel as if there was more to the story? The next morning, the Petersons arrived. They brought with them a moving truck full of belongings, far more than Jane had anticipated. Boxes were stacked in the hallway, the living room, and even the spare bedroom. Jane's attempts to organize were met with little help from Daniel, who conveniently disappeared during the chaos. As the days passed, Jane began to notice strange things. The Petersons' belongings included several locked trunks, which they refused to open in her presence. They were always whispering to each other, their conversations cutting off abruptly whenever she entered the room. And then there were the late-night noises, soft thuds and muffled voices coming from their room. Her unease grew when she overheard a phone call between Daniel and someone she didn't recognize. "Everything's in place," he whispered. "Just give me a few more days." Jane confronted him that evening. "What's going on?" Daniel looked startled but quickly masked it with a smile. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," she said. "Why are the Petersons really here? And who are you talking to on the phone?" "You're being paranoid," he said, brushing past her. "They're just friends in need." But Jane wasn't convinced. She decided to investigate. Late that night, while everyone was asleep, she crept into the hallway and examined one of the locked trunks. It was heavy, and the lock looked old and rusted. Her heart pounded as she searched for something to open it with. But before she could act, a creak in the floorboards behind her made her freeze. "What are you doing?" a voice hissed. Jane turned to see Mrs. Peterson standing in the shadows, her face partially obscured. I was just checking to make sure everything's okay," Jane stammered. Mrs. Peterson's lips curled into a tight smile. "Everything's fine," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You should go back to bed." Feeling exposed, Jane retreated to her room. But sleep was impossible. The encounter only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. The next day, she waited until the Petersons went out for a walk. Seizing the opportunity, she returned to the trunk. Using a screwdriver from the toolbox, she pried it open. Inside, she found old documents, yellowed with age, and a collection of photographs. Each photo featured a young girl who bore an eerie resemblance to Jane. Her breath caught in her throat as she shuffled through the images. Who was this girl? And why did the Petersons have these photos? Before she could delve deeper, she heard the front door open. Panic surged through her. She quickly closed the trunk and shoved it back into its place, her hands trembling. She had just managed to compose herself when the Petersons and Daniel entered the room. "Jane," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just tidying up." He narrowed his eyes but didn't press further. The Petersons exchanged a look, and Jane felt a chill run down her spine. She knew she had crossed a line, and they knew it too. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Jane could feel the weight of their gazes on her, as if they were waiting for her to slip up. She decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. After dinner, she confronted Daniel again. "I opened one of their trunks," she admitted. Daniel's face darkened. "You did what?" "There were pictures in there." "Daniel?" "Pictures of a girl who looks just like me." "What's going on?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. But then his expression softened, replaced by something she hadn't seen before. Fear. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "But you need to trust me." "How can I trust you when you won't tell me the truth?" she demanded. He hesitated, then said, "Give me one more day. I promise I'll explain everything." Reluctantly, Jane agreed. But the next day brought no answers. Instead, it brought more questions. The Petersons left early in the morning, leaving behind a note saying they would return by nightfall. Daniel disappeared soon after, claiming he had errands to run. Jane took the opportunity to search their room. This time, she found a journal tucked under the mattress. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to the plan and reclaiming what's ours. One entry stood out. She has no idea, but soon she will. And then everything will fall into place. A chill ran through her as she realized the entry was dated just a week before the Petersons moved in. That evening, the Petersons and Daniel returned together. Jane could feel the tension in the air as they sat down for dinner. She wanted to confront them, but the weight of their collective gaze silenced her. She decided to wait until everyone had gone to bed. At midnight, she slipped out of her room and headed for the journal. But when she reached their room, the journal was gone. Panic surged through her. Had they discovered her snooping? Suddenly, she heard voices coming from the living room. She crept down the hallway and peered around the corner. Daniel and the Petersons were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. "She's starting to suspect," Mrs. Peterson said. "It doesn't matter," Daniel replied. "Tomorrow, everything will be over." Jane's blood ran cold. What did they mean by over? She backed away slowly, retreating to her room. She knew she had to act fast. The next morning, she called her best friend Laura and asked her to come over. When Laura arrived, Jane quickly filled her in on everything. "You're in danger," Laura said, her eyes wide. "You need to leave." But before they could make a plan, Daniel walked in. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Nothing," Jane said quickly. But the look on his face told her he didn't believe her. That night, Jane packed a bag and waited until everyone was asleep. She slipped out of the house and drove to Laura's apartment. But as she sat on Laura's couch, her mind raced with unanswered questions. Who was the girl in the photos? What was the plan? And why did Daniel seem so complicit? The answers came the next day in the form of a letter left on Laura's doorstep. It was from Mrs. Peterson. "Dear Jane, you've been asking the wrong questions. This isn't about us. It's about you. And soon, you'll understand everything. Sincerely, Margaret Peterson." Jane's hands shook as she read the letter. Her world was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop it. Unable to let the matter rest, Jane decided to dig deeper into her past. She contacted her estranged aunt Claire, who had always been evasive about Jane's childhood. Claire hesitated at first, but eventually agreed to meet her. They sat in a quiet coffee shop, the hum of conversations providing a comforting backdrop. "You were adopted," Claire revealed, her voice trembling. "Your parents, they weren't your biological parents. They found you near the old Peterson estate." Jane's breath hitched. "What? Why didn't anyone tell me?" "It was complicated," Claire said, her eyes welling up. "There was a fire at the estate. Everyone thought the entire family had perished, but you were found in the rubble, unharmed." Jane's mind spun. Could the Petersons be connected to that fire? And if so, why had they come back into her life now? When she returned to Laura's apartment, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She checked the windows and doors, but everything seemed secure. Still, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation. Later that night, Jane's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "It's time." Her heart pounded as she showed the message to Laura. "What do they want from me?" "We need help," Laura said firmly. "I know someone who can look into this." Laura contacted a private investigator, Mark, who agreed to take the case. Within days, Mark uncovered records about the Peterson estate fire and its aftermath. "The Petersons lost a daughter in that fire," he explained. "Her name was Lillian. She was just a child." Jane felt a lump in her throat. "Do you think they believe I'm Lillian?" Mark nodded. "It's possible. They may see you as a replacement, or believe you're their daughter reincarnated." As the pieces began to fall into place, Jane realized she couldn't avoid the Petersons forever. She decided to confront them on her terms. She arranged to meet them in a public place, a bustling park where she felt safer. When the Petersons arrived, their expressions were a mix of relief and anticipation. "We knew you'd come," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice soft but firm. "I need answers," Jane said. "Why do you think I'm your daughter?" Mr. Peterson produced a locket from his pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a tiny photo of a young girl, the same girl from the pictures in their trunk. "This belonged to Lillian," he said. "You're the spitting image of her." Jane's fingers trembled as she held the locket. "But I'm not Lillian. I'm not your daughter." Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand. We lost everything that day. Finding you felt like a miracle." The conversation ended with no clear resolution. Jane left the park feeling both sympathy for the Petersons and a deep sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story. That night, she received another message. "Come home." Determined to end the ordeal, Jane returned to the house she had shared with Daniel. The Petersons were waiting for her, their expressions unreadable. Daniel stood behind them, his face pale. "We need to talk," Jane said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. What followed was a conversation that revealed decades of secrets, lies, and loss. The Petersons believed Jane was their daughter, not just because of her appearance, but because of memories they claimed she had suppressed. They spoke of events Jane couldn't remember, yet they felt hauntingly familiar. In the end, Jane made a choice. She agreed to undergo a DNA test, hoping it would provide clarity once and for all. As she waited for the results, she couldn't help but wonder, if the Petersons were right, what would that mean for the life she thought she knew? The truth, when it finally arrived, was more complicated than Jane could have imagined. But one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again.